Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, between the two rivers. I'm Bo Bonner. I am the host of the Catholic Morning Show here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, what are you up to in the old Des Moines area?
Right now, and for the foreseeable future, I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences, downtown Des Moines.
Making big predictions. Foreseeable future. No, I'm teasing.
I know, it's funny to say right now because it kind of makes it sound
right now
it might end or
it's
it just
funny.
Started.
You never noticed that like a lot of late 80s, early 90s stuff was really always talking about things like right now. Like right now. I mean, everybody was talking about right here, right now, watching the world wake up to history and stuff. I don't feel like we're talking about right now as much in the old pop music these days, Bud.
When you dropped those few notes, it reminded me
that was Van Halen.
Yeah. Pepsi Clear. I think
yes. And we even got Pepsi Clear back.
We do?
Well, for a little bit. I don't think it worked out as much as people thought either.
I didn't know Pepsi was still kicking out.
Oh, Pepsi.
About.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Someone can correct us. It was out for a little bit, but the point is.
But I'm saying Pepsi's being sold today in markets.
All of Pepsi? Yeah, man.
I think Pepsi dropped the ball in some areas. Like Coke, the polar bear was a good idea, but also like people say Jack and Coke. You don't say Jack and Pepsi. And so you just associate like.
Mountain Dew is like. Killing. I mean, like if you're an extreme man, Bud, and you need to like go down a mountain on a snowboard, you're drinking Mountain Dew.
I knew there were Pepsi products, but is there like the cola Pepsi?
Yeah, and it's all like there's Pepsi Zero and everything like that. I can't believe we're getting. Yeah, I mean, I have some at home right now.
Hey, a new issue of The Remnant just dropped. How much do you think we'd surprise our listeners if we just did an episode discussing The Remnant? I also have here
Commonweal.
We could balance it out with the National Catholic Reporter.
The
Commonweal episode from deterrence to disarmament. That's kind of Catholic social teaching.
I just think as far as someone who actually runs the full gamut of Catholic periodicals, you are alone, I think, in Des Moines as being robust and universal in the Catholic sense. Well,
I feel kind of bad, and I shouldn't admit this on air, but I'm about to anyways. It's a good time to be a subscriber. Like print media is struggling, and so what I do is like, I'm not going to subscribe to Commonweal, but if you wait long enough, they're like, we will give you money. I think the subscription for this one cost me $8.95 for the year.
That's so awesome.
I also have to mention in the intro, so the Nebraska Cornhuskers won the Crown basketball tournament.
I know.
And I've been going around telling Hawkeye fans, like, I've got my commemorative gear, and they think I'm delusional.
Do you think...
I'm basking in the glow.
Do you think it's surpassed the NIT?
Yeah, I haven't seen ratings numbers, but I think it's a nice format because the teams fly to Las Vegas, so if you're a fan... You can just take in all the games in a weekend or whatnot.
And just blow the rest of your riches on Las Vegas. Did John Leonetti make this basketball tournament?
Leonetti loved it.
He loves Las Vegas.
And the players earn money. So if you make it to the Final Four, if you win it all, there's cash prizes.
Okay. Well, I mean, in this age of NIL, that seems to make sense to me. The other one I heard is... Elias, who is now surpassed me as the person most up on sports news in general, that maybe the NCAA is truly on the way out. Have you been hearing this one?
Good riddance.
Yeah, not crying over this one.
My dad dismissively says NC2A, and it's not really an insult, but it's this term that's like just filled with derision and scorn. He's like, they got to do something about the NC2A. So, Dad, if you're listening to this,
I like it.
I'm happy for you.
That is a good wardism.
Yeah.
I'm sure Bob, if he could make a Bobism to match it, would approve.
I mean, in all seriousness, I know this isn't a sports show, but what's weird about the NC2A is like they micromanage some things. Like Jim Harbaugh got in trouble for like grilling hamburgers for recruits or something.
Right, but stealing signs.
Stealing signs, that was a serious offense in my opinion.
No, that's what I'm saying though. Yeah,
but like the Kansas Jayhawks basketball program has gotten away with, or Baylor.
Yeah.
We don't have to get into Baylor. It's not suitable for radio.
That's right. And you know what? What's probably suitable at this point is let's say we have a good show for you. You know we're good for it. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, we had such a wonderful time getting rolled up on the show in the first segment. We forgot to tell people that we have a show topic, and that topic is we're going to talk about Vatican II. Because, guys, you out there in Radio Land, I got to give you a bit of good old Dr. Bud Marr's biography here. Unbeknownst to him, when he moved back to Des Moines, what was waiting for him was to be the resident Vatican II expert. And that's not, like, just to clearly point this out, that's not what your research field is in.
No. Well, I've dabbled.
I mean, yes, I understand how, like, the sort of, like, late, early modernity makes you have, sort of this take on these things because they sort of feed into Vatican II. But very much so now, how many, what's the number of times you've talked about Vatican II in the Des Moines diocese?
I'm going on 5, I think, in a short time span.
Yeah.
But I do approach this topic with some trepidation. You and I have talked about this. There's been so much written about Vatican II.
A lot.
And
a lot.
I know historians, even secular historians, will say it's arguably the most important event of the modern era. There's almost 2 billion Catholics, and it massively impacted the experience of the faith. But in some ways, like you and I have joked, there are folks out there who are often writing on these things, and we're like, okay,
like they have an alarm set on their phone. It's
dial it back.
Yeah, you need to write the next thing on Vatican II. You haven't done it for a while.
And part of it is, like we talk about the kids, like with the new
kids these days,
the new evangelization. Like we want to attract the youth so that the faith can be passed on from generation to generation.
Yes.
And what a lot of kids don't want to hear about is like a meeting that took place
in the 60s,
60 years ago.
It's the same thing where people will sort of talk about like the Beatles as if they've just come out, and you're like, yeah, man, grandparents, people who are being buried currently, like were gaga about the Beatles. Well, at any rate, this does match up. It's not like we're talking about Vatican II out of the blue completely. Yeah. I'm not saying that we're going to make this completely bend to the archetype of our series on technology, but I do think there's a lot of overlap because Vatican II, in a way, is the sort of first council, I'm not going to say ever, but a council clearly trying to wrestle with what does it mean to be the church in the modern world, and therefore asks questions about technology, communications, mass communications, in different places got them at space. We can talk about this, but I do think a thread through what we've been talking about recently, for all of you who listen to the show regularly, is we'll talk about religion and technology and how Vatican II at least sort of sets the stage, I think it's safe to say, how a lot of Catholic social teaching engages those subjects more and more in the intervening decades.
Well, that's right. And in that sense, I do think it's very much worth talking about. And, if there's going to be a lot of print out there on the topic, like we might as well give folks the definitive take, right? But
definitive Bo and Bud take.
The radio take. But you bring up media, and we've been in this series on technology, in this series about how media influences the ecosystem, the cultural ecosystem that we live in. And I think you see this from the very beginning of the council. So for folks out there, like we don't want to assume, like people are in different places in terms of historical knowledge. Second Vatican Council, 21st Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church, takes place from 1962 to 1965. And the Pope who called the council, he kind of surprised everybody because how these things go, like the discernment that goes into electing a new pontiff, there can be like a whole host of factors. One thing that historians say about John the 23rd, so his given name was Angelo Roncalli, is that he was elected as a transitional pope or a caretaker pope. And folks
he was older comparatively.
Yeah, and sort of like I don't know if stable's the right word, but like, he wasn't radical in his theology, or sort of like a Pius IX kind of like reactionary against the modern world. So he was going to he's going to guide the church through a short window of time to the next pope. So he surprised everyone when he called the council.
He's sort of like Pius IX in that regard. Pius IX was elected as they thought he was sort of going to be the modernizing pope because he was so much more modern than Gregory the 14th or 16th, whoever it was. And so I'm with you that because John the 23rd was he was in the Vatican diplomat corps or something like this, right? He was in a pretty guy just doing his job sort of deal, and he threw everyone for a loop in that one.
So he gives this opening address at the council, and I think this really set the stage for how the bishops gathered their thought about things. And Bo, when I read this, your sort of conversation about ground and figure really comes to mind. So John the 23rd at the start of the council, he's talking about the deposit of faith. He calls it a precious treasure. And he says, part of our task here is to guard what's been passed down to us from antiquity. And so he says, the salient point of this council is not, therefore, a discussion of one article or another of the fundamental doctrine of the church. So what he's saying is, we're not, rehashing things. We don't have to. He's kind of intimating, there's not, this pressing crisis like you saw with the Protestant Reformation. But he wants to.
Or even Vatican I.
Yeah, Vatican I with some of the political things going on.
Yep.
But he wants to, for lack of a better term, re-communicate the truth of the gospel for modern people. So for these things that I've just mentioned, a council is not necessary, but from the renewed, serene, and tranquil adherence to all the teaching of the church in its entirety. And then he makes this interesting point about re-proposing it to the people of today. And he says the substance of the ancient doctrine of the deposit of faith is one thing, and the way in which it is presented is another, and it is the latter that must be taken into great consideration with patience if necessary, everything being measured in the forms and proportions of a magisterium which is predominantly pastoral in character. So this kind of gets to some of the points we've been making the last few weeks, where he says we have this deposit of faith, and oftentimes it's almost so close to our to us that we sort of take it for granted. You hear these things in catechism classes and things like this, but he says as we look out in the world, there needs to be this renewed presentation of the gospel. And it's not that we're questioning or wrestling over the doctrines. That's one thing. How they're expressed is another. Now, when I hear that, Bo, I do have a thought that can be almost kind of a dangerous task, or it's one fraught with pitfalls.
And I think that's really interesting. That was where I was going to go. So good job.
Yes.
So on one hand, it's important to think exactly like you said, that you can say something stays the same as much as you want, but if you put it in a different medium, so let's just, like you said, let's harp on something we've been talking about for a while, but you can read aloud a poem and then read it and then watch it, so let's just say a story, though. But you start to see, right, that this is why the movie is never enough like the book, or vice versa, is it's not only that, sometimes they alter content, but they could follow the book exactly, and the movie won't be the same as the book. Yeah. So already he's correct in, like you said, this very profound way. And, to even sort of it's sort of irony about what's in this sense about the reader knows more than what the person writing at the time was. But the sort of huge, massive social shifts that happen in those years, because 1962, if everyone remembers, is still the 50s in a big way. Yeah. We were talking about the Beatles earlier, but this is Doing That Thing You Do, Beatles. And by the end of this, it's the Beatles talking about yellow submarines because they're on drugs.
I Am the Walrus.
Yes. So you see how much you can call a council on accident and say, from the serenity of the deposit of faith, let's consider about what it is that modern humanity needs to hear. And, as I like to point out, is he can talk about the serenity of faith, and he can say there's no pressing doctrinal issue that almost always is the reason why councils have been called in the past. But certainly, Bud, there was this big event. You might have heard of it. It was World War II, and everyone alive in that generation who would have been a bishop was ordained and lived through World War II.
Yeah.
Everyone, Bud, they're all having these first discussions of Vatican II, in places that, 15 years before, Mussolini had prisoners and stuff. I mean, like, you think about what, Pius XII went through. The Serenity stuff, it seems like a little bit of like and I'm not even trying to be mean. It's almost sort of, it was a wish fulfillment, right? They were hoping, like, right, everything's okay, right? Yeah. But we all know 1962 through 1965, Vietnam is on the horizon, everything to do with, sort of like Cold War and everything like that. So I understand, like, on one sense, it's absolutely true to say there were no pressing doctrinal matters at that time, but the big revolution in sort of the way culture would use media to understand itself right at that time. And it's not that this was causal of that. It's like they couldn't have known how revolutionary those intervening years were about to be.
Well, this is an interesting question. And when you dive into some of the literature, like some of what's been written about the council, like a trope that you hear in commentators is that there was no pressing crisis. And what these scholars have in mind is something like Protestantism or like the Arian controversy that sparked the Council of Nicaea. But there is a sense of optimism not only at the beginning of the council, but as the council gets underway and wraps up. You hear this in John the 23rd. In that same speech, at one point, he criticizes what he calls prophets of doom. Mm-hmm. Or like in other translations, I've even seen like prophets of gloom, which sounds like a pretty cool emo band. But
prophets of doom is metal.
Yeah.
Sorry, keep going.
But I don't know exactly who he's thinking about there. Like maybe it's sort of like the kind of like curial mindset or like the neo-scholastic theology that's kind of like really down on the modern world. I know that Hans Urs von Balthasar, a prominent theologian at the time, wrote this book called Raising the Bastions, so R-A-Z-I-N-G, like tearing down the walls, that the church had developed this kind of like defensive posture towards the world. And we need to, John the 23rd, I think in his journal writes about this, like throw open the windows and, let out the message that the church has. But I don't know, this is where, we can think about as Catholics, as we wrestle with church teaching and what the church has proclaimed to us, this isn't even getting to the documents yet. It's sort of like understanding what's taking place around the council. And, it's something that gives you pause. Like John Henry Newman, who I've written about, he said what the Holy Spirit guarantees is not like the discernment that takes place in the council. And we know from conciliar history that like there's often very fierce arguments,
messiness,
political machinations. He guarantees basically like the final word. And so I don't think
behavior that we would not want our children to follow. How about
guys,
that?
We're sending the bishops to a timeout. And I think that's worth asking, Bo. Like maybe it's a fair historical question. Like was the optimism and maybe it's too exaggerated? And in fairness to John the 23rd and the bishops gathered in council, I don't think they could have guessed the direction that society was taking.
Yeah, I always think about it in terms of like a hurricane. Now, let me back up. Depending on where you're at in the world, there is plenty going wrong at the end of the 50s and early 60s. But if you want me to say, like, okay, in the sort of media lens of Europe and America, who obviously are really taking the cake here because of like what happened with World War II, and let's be even more specific, but in the mouthpiece of the Allies, you can understand how right after the Korean War and right before the Vietnam War really picks up, it's like an eye of a hurricane. So the front part of the storm in many ways is the worst part, right? And that is everything that was like the brutal, basically the entirety of the stock market crash. World War I into 1948 was just brutal. And then Korea and stuff like that. There's a lot of tremors in the 50s. But you can imagine how people go, 1962, maybe things have like settled down a little bit. And the church sees that, right? The church thinks about, especially at that time, thinking that they played a really important role in seeing Europe and America and the world through the brutality of World War II. Right. But that was the eye of a hurricane, because very soon after that, the world goes on the brink of war multiple times, and then the church starts suffering. I mean, in so many ways that we're still dealing with the impact of all of those things.
I think that churchmen were confident at the time because, like you said, that we had sort of survived World War II, and the church had played a role in shepherding souls through that, horrific sort of experience of the two world wars. Secondly, like in different parts of the world, like vocations were booming, missionary efforts were very fruitful. And so I think someone like John the 23rd had like this sense that we have something like a very important gift to give to people who are looking for meaning and looking for direction. All that being said, like the question of what sort of crisis lay behind the council. I mean, I think even someone like Roncalli would have admitted that there were particular heresies that were alive and flourishing. I'm stealing this from, I can't remember the priest who I heard talk about this. I think it was Donald Calloway, but he said the major heresies of the 20th century were attacks on the dignity of the human person.
Yeah.
So you think about the use of atomic weaponry.
Yep.
That, I mean, you could get into almost any part of modern warfare, like mustard gas, bombing, trench warfare.
Machine guns.
Yeah.
I mean,
and then when you reach mid 20th century, like this is where this is taking off right when the council is starting. But the widespread availability of artificial contraception, the increase in the prevalence of abortion in Western societies and things like that, all these ways where like the human person is being attacked.
Mass consumerism at a scale never known in human history. I mean, yeah, it's all on the brink. And, but if the difference between the front side of the hurricane of modernity versus the backside is the backside seems so antiseptic compared to the front. I mean, the front was like fascism and Stalinism and brutality and power and like blood and gore.
Yeah. And
the backside was a lot of, clinically clean killing behind closed doors. Yeah. And I think that, any rate, we're not even into the documents yet.
Welcome to your weekend. Sunshine conversation. Yeah. No, but you make a really important point a few minutes ago when you talked about Christians experiencing different things in different parts of the world. And I think as a global body, that's important to call to mind sometimes, where Catholicity is a gift. And it's really powerful that, like we can worship God in the same way in different parts of the world. And we're united by our confession of the creed, and we're pastored by a universal shepherd. But, you see, well, we can get into this with future episodes, but whenever the church is teaching, that's going to be received in different ways depending on your context. And I'm not saying that to relativize the teaching. That's just to make us attuned to how different truths are heard depending on your experiences. So I think about something like the conversation around religious freedom religious liberty that kicks off at the council. Mm-hmm. And there are American figures like someone like John Courtney Murray, a Jesuit, who is like, yeah, we need to talk about these things. These are really important. And for, the faith to be taken seriously in our context, we have to address this in an intelligible way. And then as Americans, when the document Dignitatis Humanae is released about this topic, we sort of read it through a very American lens. Mm-hmm. The more that I've digged into the background to all that, I think the primary concern among many of the bishops was the persecution of Christians in countries where there wasn't a lot of religious freedom.
Yeah, and I know this from like Russell Hidendry makes this point, is imagine someone like John Paul II, who at this point is, just Carl, and he's living in Poland behind the Iron Curtain. And all of a sudden, religious freedom is a completely different animal than Americans who may or may not be trying to fit it to the Constitution, for instance.
Yeah. So all these questions, like we'll kind of unpack some of this as the series goes on. But something like, to throw out another document, Nostra Aetate, on the church's relation to non-Christian religions, it gets into the question about the church's history with the Jewish people. And again, we sort of like, maybe for us, even like, especially today, I would say, where there's certain assumptions, we read that document, we're like, oh yeah, this is like obvious. It was a topic fraught with challenges precisely because, the state of Israel as a political entity is founded in 1948.
Yep.
That of course creates certain tensions in the Middle East. And so as that topic's being discussed, of course, there are bishops like in that part of the world who are saying like, let's be careful how we address this because it's going to impact our flock in a certain way. And that's not to say like, I'm not giving the impression of like shying away from the truth, but it just, the church's leaders are presented with like this unique task of talking about the truths of the faith in such a way that it can be life-giving to people in all parts of the world.
I mean, to end this segment real quick, I think the best way to say it is John the 23rd started out going like, hey, the truth's not going to change. No big deal. Let's just think about the sort of package the truth comes in. And then that becomes like the thing of the modern world. And it sort of undergirds all of the arguments that come hereafter. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. As you're probably sniffing out, we're already becoming a sub-series within a larger series. We're talking about Vatican II, Bud. And again, like because everything is such about the context in which truths that have always necessarily been true are situated, I think it's fair to say that you and I have situated this in the context of media technology and sort of the themes we've been talking about this year.
Well, there's a lot more that could be said about the background to the council. We could talk about Protestantism, the Enlightenment, the modernist controversy. Maybe we'll sprinkle that in as the series goes along.
Just for flavor.
I think what I'd like to tackle next, and this really ties in with what we're saying about media and how this influences the way that we understand and view the world. So, John the 23rd, as we talked about, he wants to kind of like re-propose the truths of the faith for modern people. And again, when you read some of the history of the council, there are these like three main principles of reform that are talked about. And I don't know, like, I'm not sure exactly when this language was first used or, how often it's used like on the floor of the council. But I think it's fair to say like this is a pretty accurate description. So this first one, it's kind of fun to say on radio. Aggiornamento.
Aggiornamento.
A term we're not readily familiar with, Italian term. And I don't speak Italian, but I hear from others that it's difficult to translate. There's not really like a great English equivalent, but it can mean like updating or modernizing. And as we were sort of gesturing towards during that first segment, that's tough. So like it's only fair to say like in each generation, how do you communicate the truths of the faith such that it resonates with the listeners? On the other hand, John the 23rd says like the deposit of faith has this solidity to it. And so is there a way that you could sort of like restate things that actually doesn't do justice to what's been received?
And real quick, but I know we love tangents, but this one I think helps. I think about branding in this very strict sense. I'm not trying to say that church tried to rebrand itself, although I will say some people kind of went that direction, and that was very problematic. But let's just think about brands and how people will get very mad when a brand rebrands. And on one hand, you go, oh, well, if there's continuity, people will be fine. But some people are really attached to it. But look, if you're a marketing guy, let's talk about you can think about our friends who do marketing. You have this thing you have to split, right? You have to be noticeably connected to what's the past. But if your brand looks like you made it in 1970 and like you have never dusted it off, that has its own issues too. So sometimes people get obsessed about like, if the church never changes or it should change all the time. But part of it is just this very human thing that I think what you're getting at is you can imagine with an aggiornamento, you go, okay, John the 23rd, let's think about opening the windows and letting air in. But man, like you start pulling on that sweater and it's hard to like beforehand decide where you would stop with that.
One way it's been explained to me, and you let me know if this is like if I'm veering off the path here.
Heresy.
So the language of transubstantiation, and this is really articulated in a profound way by St. Thomas Aquinas. And today, transubstantiation is sort of the orthodox way of understanding the real presence of Christ under the species of bread and wine. Someone told me that, a teacher, in fact, that it's not that the church is in principle opposed to other ways of articulating those same truths. It's just that there hasn't been another proposal that was sufficient or adequate in the way that transubstantiation is. So apparently like some theologians, again, like sort of middle part of the 20th century where there's all this exploratory theology going on, someone said like, what about transsignification?
Yeah.
So that like
it was a problem.
It's a new signifier once it's consecrated.
And the thing is, Bud, right, is like, on one hand, this is what theologians have done throughout time. And there's a way in which you go, okay, like, well, let's do that. Theologians do that. But like, that's what theologians do. Let's not make it like the news media is waiting to hear new theories. And I think this is where a lot of like aggiornamento can have two very different interpretations of just the word and the concept, right? So if we want to go, hey, theologians are going to like try out some new moves, as long as the church can go, okay, that doesn't work, and everyone goes, okay, well, we gave it a good try. But that's not what happens. And part of it is the worldwide importance of TV, bud, 1962 to 1965. And all of a sudden the news media, but think about like what like Lateran 4 would have been like if they had daily reports the whole world bored out of their skull listened to. And you start to see why we get like celebrity theologians, but those two words should make you throw up a little in your mouth. But this is when this started to get invented in a real way.
Well, and this is where, in my opinion, it does go off the rails a little bit. So with the Aggiornamento, there's sort of this strong desire to, how do I say it? Like have a certain kind of authenticity in the practice of the faith. Mm-hmm. So I think we've brought this up on previous episodes, but folks, good ideas are worth stating more than once. Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, talks about like after the council, there's this push to say like, well, we don't want folks just to do rote penance, right? That they're just kind of going through the motions. So instead of saying like, don't eat fish on Fridays, we'll have, the faithful choose a penance that's meaningful and, authentically expresses their contrition. But what happens, she says, is that you take all of these hooks that people like almost instinctively hang their faith on, and you rip those away. And then, Joe Schmo in the pews or whoever, like he's sort of left flapping in the wind. And this kind of like this instinctual perception of the faith that we took for granted, it's gone. And as human beings, like most of us just aren't up to the task of like building our spirituality from the ground up.
Again, this is going to be a weird metaphor, but it's actually, to me, like holograms. So holograms are literally, well, let me show you, they're light interferent patterns, right? And what's funny about a hologram is you can disturb certain amounts of it, and it won't mess up the hologram. But at some point, which is hard to tell, if you disturb too much of the light interference pattern, the whole thing goes away. And to your Mary Douglas point, what she's sort of getting at is ritual is similar. Mm-hmm. You can never tell, not only for like a whole group, but each individual. You can disrupt this ritual, but maybe this one. But at some point, which no one knows beforehand, if you interfere with enough of them, the whole structure collapses. And this is not to say that like that means that we should like never change things or we should be rigid or all these things. Yeah. Nothing to this. But it is to say, in an overly optimistic age that's in the eye of a hurricane and doesn't realize it, that is now under the scrutiny of broadcast media in a way the church was simply not prepared for, what could be, hey, let's actually take some of these old, cars out of the garage and see if they can still go 0 to 60, became every church ritual was on public trial about whether it should continue. Not according to the church, of course, but it's fair to say there was a real sentiment of that, at least in significant sectors of the church.
Yeah, so don't hear us wrongly. We're not, overtly criticizing Aggiornamento. I think what John the 23rd was calling the bishops to undertake was a worthwhile task. But when I read this part of the history of Vatican II, it's almost like I can see the Holy Father like going out on sort of a precipice or a cliff. And I'm like, wow, that's, an impressive sort of thing to undertake. But I do know the challenges that come with it. And that's where the other two principles of reform, they sort of, I think, put some guardrails around this idea. Because updating, at least in English ears, when we hear that sort of thing, it can mean a lot of different things to different people. But the second sort of principle of reform that scholars of the council talk about is ressourcement. So this is a French term. And it means something like resourcing, but the goal here was to go back to the sources. So first and foremost, to go back to the sources of early Christianity, not simply sacred scripture, but also the church fathers. So the patristic era, sort of like you could say circa 50 AD to the Council of Nicaea in 325. Well, you'd probably push a little further than that. So go back to those sources. But even beyond that, like in the reception of the treasures of the Middle Ages, to read those sources in the original, right? And so someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, he's revered in the early 20th century, but a lot of seminarians, so guys going into the priesthood, they're learning about Thomas through commentaries on Thomas, like through manuals. And there's this whole system called neo-scholasticism, which is like it is a very like tight, impressive system. It's conceptually very careful and clear in its distinctions. But it's almost like some guys were more familiar with the manuals than they were with Thomas himself.
Yeah.
And so there are, you talk about celebrity theologians, prominent names, at least to those who have studied theology, like De Lubac, Jean Danielou, Yves Congar, Hans-Urs von Balthasar. And they're saying, man, there's some really amazing stuff in the original, like with the OGs. And so like we have to go back to Thomas. We have to read St. Augustine, Irenaeus on down the line.
And what's interesting about that too, Bud, of course, is what you start to mean by, ressourcement. Like when you're resourcing, when you're going back to the sources, this starts to be an argument about what that means as well, because this is also sort of the height of a sort of archaeologyism, right? Where like everybody kind of thought like, well, we'll just go back to the originals and we'll show the unvarnished truth and we'll know what it means. And of course, it's hard to act like you can go back and pull. I mean, just think about like an object that you pull out of the ground that's 1,000 years old. It takes a while to interpret what that means to us is different than what it meant to the people back then. Yeah. And I mean, not to jump ahead, I know that like we'll probably have to have a whole episode or two about the controversies about the document on the liturgy. But this is a big one, Bud. Like people straight up at that time were finding prayers that they said were original to like the 2nd century that have subsequently been proven to be forgeries or like just like miscalculated about when they happened. Like I'm not lying about this one, right?
No, or maybe like written by theologians who are sort of suspect, later. Yeah. So, yeah.
So the idea, of course, right, is that it can, like, ressourcement on one hand can seem as an anchor to help ground aggiornamento, but it has its own fight going as well.
Well, not aggiornamento. Ressourcement is an art form, and there's always kind of this delicate balance between recovering the treasures of the past, but not allowing that endeavor to degrade or sort of like make us blind to the treasures that are more recent in our history. And so, the prominent example that I think about this conversation, Bo, is with so Pius XII was the Pope immediately preceding John the 23rd. And in 1947, he writes this encyclical Mediator Dei. Mm-hmm. And when we read this today, we don't, I think, fully get this, but it was kind of, you could say, a cutting edge encyclical about the liturgy. And he's talking about more frequent Holy Communion, and he's pushing folks to like actually avail themselves of the sacred music, like that, this great tradition of music in the church. But he stops at one point in the document. He says, in saying all this, I am not calling for what he calls an antiquarianism. He says there are folks out there who want to criticize things like black vestments for requiem masses, or he said like the celebration of a private mass where a priest may not have a congregation gathered for the celebration of the mass. He said they do these things saying like, well, these are later developments. He says like that would be a misunderstanding of what I'm calling for.
Yeah, and it would be like, you could imagine you come home from college your senior year for Thanksgiving, and your mom pulls out like a photo album, and she goes, "Oh, do you remember when you were 7? You should be like that now. Why aren't you like that?" And you'd be like, maybe it's important to like remind you, right? Like, oh, remember when you were a kid and you were like this, and that doesn't. But like to go like everything you've done since you were 7 is wrong is a weird way to take it.
So it's good to have that historical consciousness.
Wait, what was the third one?
No, I'm going to get to it.
Okay, good.
I was just going to make one last point about that one, but not to get carried away in either direction, not to have this like this sort of like only what was given to us in the first few centuries is authentic. I mean, I've heard kind of like people joke about this a little bit, like, in the time of St. Paul, he's not probably like assigning the rosary as penance for confessors, right?
Yeah.
So the last principle of reform is one near and dear to my heart. And I think it's actually, if you want to say like, how do we put flesh and bones on aggiornamento or updating? Development of doctrine.
Yeah.
And so John Courtney Murray, who I've already mentioned, in his writings on the council, he said it was the issue underneath all the issues. And as these various topics are discussed and debated at the council, the question that the council fathers are wrestling with is like, is this sort of like, is this document that in which we're, to borrow like John the 23rd's language, reproposing a truth of the faith, is it an authentic development of what's been given to us? So like the document on religious freedom, I mean, we can say on air, this is not secret knowledge. It's controversial. There's a lot of heated debate. The celebration of the liturgy and vernacular, this kicks off a lot of conversation, heated conversation on the council floor. And what the council fathers are asking is this an authentic development or is it a corruption? And of course, this goes back in many ways to St. John Henry Newman. He's written like the classical treatment of development of doctrine. It was instrumental in my own faith journey. And really, to put it in a nutshell, because it's hard to encapsulate Newman's great book like in a few words, he says, like we sometimes have this idea in our minds that the spring is nearest its source. But he says it's not really that way in the history of ideas. With ideas, they actually become clearer and more powerful through it's more akin to like the journey of a raging river. Mm-hmm. And I didn't capture it in the poetic way that Newman does. But Newman is kind of, again, fighting this kind of antiquarianism. And what he's trying to show to his Protestant readers is that these theological articulations of the faith, whether that's saying like the Son of God is consubstantial with the Father, or talking about transubstantiation when it comes to real presence, certain ideas about purgatory, that they were the natural developments of what was handed on originally.
Yeah, and I think that this is where it's, you don't want to talk about Vatican II as like if you're keeping score or if you were trying to make like a table, but this is where it does kind of get difficult sometimes. But to think about from Vatican II forward, a lot of what I think, like if you're a young kid or you're a young convert, let's put it this way, you've converted to the Catholic faith, but you're only 25, you can get the idea, right, that people who are very pro-Vatican II, to put it very stereotypically, they must be all about what's new and what's great and like doing whatever you want. But the people who were very pro-Vatican II coming in and outside of the council, they were making appeals to the early church to actually correct what they thought were corruption. So there's a fight about what you mean by traditionalist, bud. This is what I think people forget sometimes, is a lot of the heat of Vatican II was what really serves as tradition. Yeah. And so it starts to be weird that you're this new convert in 2025, you didn't read much about the church, but you like landed in the middle of all these disputes. But the traditionalists in some ways are more modern than what people end up calling the Vatican II progressives, who are making arguments about what they perceive as earlier formations of the church that got lost for a whole host of reasons.
And this is something I really struggle with. So when you talk about the reception of the council, like how it was received after it concluded, there were some rocky times. And in 2005, I believe, around that time period, this might have been later in his papacy, Pope Benedict XVI, he gave this whole Christmas address on the reception of the council. And he said basically like two major fronts have emerged. One he called the hermeneutic of discontinuity, which sort of like posits a rupture between the pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II church. He said it's really gotten carried away by the media. And so he sort of like, he criticized that and said that's not the right way to go. Instead, we have to have a hermeneutic of reform, of renewal and continuity. That even his interpretation, so coming from a pope, there have been folks who write about the council and they say like, well, if you overemphasize continuity, you won't understand fully the important things that took place because there are these discontinuities and those are really significant as well. But to me, when I read those kind of takes, it sort of feels like the first time in Catholic history where folks are like, the discontinuity almost happens by happenstance, meaning like as human beings, we're kind of prone to error. And at different points in church history, these figures, even within the church, emerge who say things wrongly, and then the church needs to correct its course.
Right.
I know what they're kind of driving at. They're saying like, we don't want to downplay the significant achievements of the council, but I still think that Pope Benedict's proposal is a safer course and captures this kind of like, I think that's more of what John the 23rd was trying to do.
Yeah, and I mean, not to pull this move, but there's continuity with a capital C and a lowercase c, and there's discontinuity with a capital, you get what I'm saying, is Benedict XVI, of all people, especially if you know what he himself was up to during the council, and in ways he was sort of criticizing what would have been like. Anyway, the point that I'm getting at is what he's trying to say is the foundational principle of a council can't be discontinuity.
Yeah.
It's continuity. That might mean that, yes, we have to sort of like square round circles, or however you want to say it. But that doesn't mean that should be like the impulse that is driving you forward. But
I know we're running short on time, but I think the last thing that I would throw in there, and I just want to flag this to come back to in a later episode. So you talked about the language of traditionalism, and you could also talk about being conservative.
Yeah.
And sometimes those modes fall into conserving what? And sometimes it's like conserving a certain kind of modernity. I think the truly like prophetic voices at the council who were doing some important work, they were conservative, but even in a more radical sense. And so to give you sort of like a sneak preview, when you talk about something like religious liberty, I think the heart of that document is that coercion has no place in the reception of the faith. Like true faith is not coerced. And that's a more conservative truth in the sense that it goes back to some of the earliest articulations of the gospel. And I think that's true ressourcement.
Absolutely. We have so much more to talk about. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. But I don't know if we kind of do this all the time. I don't know if I want to say I thought we were going to do truly one episode on Vatican II, but certainly the case, the pace we're doing it at, there's no way we're doing only two. That much I've learned.
No, I hope that whetted the audience's appetite, because I felt like we almost ended on a cliffhanger. And I'm excited for the next few episodes. Like next week, maybe we can tackle Sacrosanctum Concilium,
the first
on
page.
The liturgy.
No, I'm teasing.
And there's a lot of fascinating stuff there, especially in light of what we've been saying about media technology and its influence on our lives. So
I really do think that this starts to be the crux of what I'll say real quick for previews of what's coming next. There's obviously the way in which the church has always spoken symbolic language. And funny enough, right, it's exactly a symbol does its job when you don't notice the symbol, because the symbol so thoroughly points to what it's trying to symbolize. But in times when things get sort of rough and in question, the symbols come into sharp focus, right? And so we have to have these like very difficult questions about what we've assumed for most of the time. In a similar way, you then also have to like throw in the fact that media truly makes this a worldwide conversation, so that the church fathers are not able to step out after like 4 years and go, this is what we've decided. And so very interesting times and an interesting motif and lens to look through all of it.
Well, and one thing we can get into as the series wraps up when we get to that point is that we're talking about Vatican II, but the kind of like lessons that you can glean are applicable in other contexts. So, you know, I feel like, again, to mention folks who call themselves traditionalists, they can get in this mode with like Trent, the Council of Trent, to think like it was kind of just this like pristine set of propositions that fell from the sky. But, you know, there's the advent of new media behind that council with the printing press, and also, you know, a lot of debate on the ground there about how to handle all that.
Absolutely. Well, on the ground, Bud, how do people pray with us?
So do pray with us. We pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy on air at 4 a.m., followed by the Holy Rosary with Mother Angelica. Later in the morning, we do the Rosary again at 10 a.m., followed by Daily Mass. And then you can wrap up your evening with the Holy Rosary read by or prayed by Father Groeschel at 8:30 p.m.
Also, if you want to make sure to do things with people who are fellow listeners at Iowa Catholic Radio in and around the listening area, easy to find out. Go to iowacatholicradio.com and go to the events page. We, of course, had some rather massive events that have been happening. We hope people got to make it to Encountering the Eucharist with Mike Schmitz, for instance, but also very regular events. So, for instance, if you can make it to 11:30 First Fridays, so 11:30 a.m. on the first Friday of the month, at Iowa Catholic Radio Studio, we make sure to have Mass there as well. So we got a lot going on. I think the next big thing, Bud, is probably the golf outing in May, where you and I classically have never won, never gotten close to winning, and are usually either in last or close there too. Also, if you want to make sure that this keeps going on, this wonderful ministry, know that it's not just the ministry of the people behind the mics, behind the boards, or behind the desk. It is your ministry as well. You make it possible through your prayers, but also through your volunteer efforts. But of course, it's very important to say you make it possible through your material support. Your donations make this ministry possible. All of the good works that it does accrues to you. At the end of time, bud, there will be people that they don't know, our dear listeners, who will advocate for them because they supported Iowa Catholic Radio, and it was there for them in a time when people absolutely needed it. You can donate by going to iowacatholicradio.com, or you can go to, you can call 515-223-1150 or text 515-223-1150 in order to keep this ministry running. Bud, it's always a interesting time. I don't know if it's an aggiornamento time necessarily, but every time we come up with a new idea, I do feel like we fling the windows open and I can hear Italians singing, or at least John Leonetti.
Well, for those who are listening live, it is the weekend of Palm Sunday. Hard to believe. I'd be remiss not to wish everyone a very fruitful end to their Lent and a blessed Easter.
Absolutely. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, planet, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.